town of Red Rock Gulch lay quiet under a blanket of dust and heat. The sun baked the earth until it cracked, and the wooden buildings that lined the single main street looked like they might collapse if the desert wind blew a little harder. Wagons rattled past the saloon. The blacksmith hammered out iron at a steady rhythm, and the smell of horse sweat mixed with whiskey in the air. It was the Wild West, hard, cruel, and unforgiving. And into this town rode a man named Caleb Hart, a cowboy whose boots were worn, whose hat carried the stains of years on the trail, and whose face bore the rough lines of a man who had seen both too much and not enough of life. He wasn't the kind of man who stood out at first glance, but his eyes, sharp, gray, and restless, had a way of holding on to things others overlooked. Caleb wasn't in Red Rock Gulch to stir trouble. He came chasing the whisper of work, maybe a cattle drive, maybe a rancher in need of hands. What he didn't expect was that his fate would be tangled up in a thing no cowboy ever thought he'd spend coin on: a rusty old safe. The auction that morning. The town gathered in the dusty yard beside the sheriff's office. A wagon had arrived from the outskirts, stacked high with the belongings of a rancher who'd died without kin. Folks said the man had been a drifter turned homesteader, and when he keeled over, everything he owned was hauled into town to be sold off cheap. Old chairs, a busted rifle, tin pots, a trunk full of moth-eaten clothes, and at the back of the wagon, half buried under a tarp, sat a squat, heavy iron safe, its paint long gone, its hinges orange with rust. Sheriff Thomas McGraw, a barrel-chested lawman with a white mustache that caught every speck of dust, announced the auction with a booming voice. "All right, folks. We'll start with the small stuff. Highest bidder takes it. Coins on the barrel head. A one-by-one. Items were sold for pennies. A farmer's wife bought the cooking pots. A miner picked up the rifle for a couple dollars, even though the stock was cracked." The auction was lively enough, with townsfolk muttering and laughing between bids. Then the tarp came off the safe. The crowd chuckled. "Look at that piece of junk." Someone jeered. "Can't even open it," another said. "Ain't no key, ain't no worth." The safe looked like it had been dragged through 50 years of storms. Its surface was pitted, its dial stiff, the door fused with rust. "Who'd buy a coffin for money you can't touch?" laughed a saloon regular. Even the sheriff smirked. "All right, folks, here it is. Old rancher's safe. Don't know what's inside, don't know if it even opens. What'll you give?" Silence. Then a mocking voice rang out from the back. "I'll give a nickel, to use it for target practice." The crowd roared with laughter, but Caleb didn't laugh. He stood with his hands hooked in his belt, eyes fixed on that safe. Something about it stirred a flicker of curiosity in him. Maybe it was the weight of it. Maybe it was the way the rancher had guarded it all his life, without telling a soul. Or maybe Caleb had lived too long in the West not to know that things most folks ignored sometimes carried the deepest secrets. "I'll give $2, Caleb said. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. $2, for that hunk of rust, a miner scoffed. "You wastin' your money, cowboy." Another spat tobacco in the dust. But the sheriff, seeing a sale where none was likely, raised his hand. $2. Any other bids? The crowd muttered, but no one raised a hand. "Sold." To the cowboy. A chorus of snickers followed as Caleb hauled the safe off the wagon. It was heavier than it looked, and it scraped a groove in the dirt as he dragged it toward the livery stable where he was renting a stall. "They'll be laughin' about you for a week, stranger," the stable hand muttered. Caleb only tipped his hat. "Reckon they might." The mockery word traveled fast in Red Rock Gulch. By evening, everyone in the saloon knew about the fool cowboy who'd paid $2 for a worthless iron safe. When Caleb walked into the Silver Spur saloon, boots thudding on the plank floor, all eyes turned. The piano stopped playing, whiskey glasses clinked, and someone shouted, "Hey cowboy, you get that safe open yet? Or you usin' it for a bedroll?" A laughter exploded. Caleb ignored them, stepped up to the bar, and ordered a whiskey. The bartender, a lean man with a scar running down his cheek, poured the drink with a grin. "Not often we see a man buy something no one else wants," he said. "Reckon I've done that my whole life," Caleb replied, his voice low and even. The saloon doors swung open, and in strode Jack Slater, a known outlaw who wore his arrogance like a badge. He was the kind of man folks crossed the street to avoid. Black coat, silver spurs, a revolver slung low on his hip. His gang followed him like shadows. Slater spotted Caleb and smirked. "Well, if it ain't the treasure hunter. Tell me, cowboy, you reckon that safe's got gold inside, or just dust and cobwebs like your pockets?" The room erupted again. Caleb met Slater's gaze without flinching. "Don't reckon it's any of your concern what's in it." That answer seemed to amuse Slater more than anger him. He leaned close, voice dropping. "Maybe it ain't. But I got a nose for secrets. You keep an eye on that box of yours, stranger. Might be someone else wants it more than you do." Caleb sipped his whiskey, but the outlaw's words lingered. The struggle to safe was no ordinary burden. That night, under the flickering lamplight of the stable, Caleb tried every trick he knew. He hammered at the hinges. He pried at the door with a crowbar. He spun the dial until his fingers ached. The safe wouldn't budge. "Stubborn old thing," he muttered. The horses snorted softly in their stalls, as if mocking his efforts. Sweat rolled down his back. Hours passed, and frustration grew. But Caleb was nothing if not patient. Life on the trail had taught him that the hardest ground sometimes yielded the richest veins. At last, he stopped, leaned against the safe, and let his mind wander. Why had the rancher kept it locked all those years? Why had no one known the contents? And why did Slater seem suddenly so interested? There was a story here, Caleb knew. A story locked in iron and rust, and he was determined to crack it open. The following morning, Caleb woke to find boot prints in around the stable. Fresh prints. Someone had been there in the night. The stable hand swore he hadn't seen a thing. But Caleb knew better. That afternoon, as he was walking the street, Sheriff McGraw caught up to him. "Caleb, I've been hearing talk. Slater's been asking questions about that safe. Don't know what you got yourself into, but I'd keep that box close." "I intend to," Caleb said. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You stir up trouble in this town, I won't hesitate to run you out. Understand?" Caleb nodded. "I understand." But as the sheriff walked away, Caleb's gut told him trouble wasn't just stirring. It was already here. A shadow on the trail. That night, Caleb carried the safe out of the stable and loaded it onto a small wagon. He decided it wasn't wise to keep it in town where every drunk and outlaw knew about it. The desert stretched wide and silent under the stars as he rode out, the wagon wheels creaking, the safe rattling with each bump. He aimed for the foothills where an old cabin lay abandoned, a place no one would think to look. But he wasn't alone. From the ridge above, dark shapes moved. Slater's men, watching, following, waiting. And as Caleb set up camp beside the cabin, striking a fire to chase off the night, the glint of steel caught the moonlight. A rifle barrel. A whisper of boots on stone. The outlaws were closing in. The desert air was cold, sharp enough to bite through Caleb's worn coat. The flames of his campfire cracked and spit, casting long shadows on the scrub and rocks. He sat with his back against the wagon wheel, hat tipped low, one hand on his revolver, the other resting on the whiskey flask he hadn't touched. Because he wasn't alone. Somewhere in the dark, the outlaw Jack Slater and his men prowled. Caleb could feel them, hear the crunch of boots in sand, catch the faint jingle of a spur when the wind shifted. They were waiting, wolves circling a campfire, testing the edge of his patience. And at the center of it all sat the rusty safe, unmoving, unyielding, heavy as sin. The ambush, it came just before midnight. A gunshot cracked the silence. The bullet whined off the wagon's iron rim. Caleb rolled, drew, and fired back in the same breath. The flash of his Colt lit up a shadow diving behind a boulder. Another shot, another. Then the whole canyon came alive with muzzle fire. Caleb dropped flat, using the safe itself as cover. Iron groaned as lead sparked against it. The outlaws who had mocked him now found themselves shielded out by the very thing they wanted. "Drop the iron, cowboy!" Slater's voice rang out from the ridge. "Give me the safe and you walk away," Caleb shouted back. "If it's worthless, why you so keen to bleed for it?" That earned a pause. Then Slater laughed, cold and sharp. "Ain't your concern what's inside. You just hand it over and maybe I won't put you in the ground." But Caleb knew something. The rancher who had owned that safe hadn't been rich. He'd barely scraped by, and yet he'd clung to it until death. Whatever was inside wasn't gold, not just gold. It was bigger, so Caleb answered by cocking his revolver. The gunfight blazed on. Sparks flew, the fire guttered, bullets chewed the wagon's wood. Caleb fired until the hammer clicked empty. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay sprawled in the dust, and the rest melted back into the hills with curses trailing behind. But Slater's voice carried one last promise. This ain't over, cowboy. That safe belongs to me. The breakthrough the next day. Caleb dragged the battered safe into the cabin. His hands shook with exhaustion, but his mind burned with a single thought. What's in it? He worked the dial again, slow and patient. He pressed his ear to the metal, listening for clicks. Hours passed. Sweat trickled. Finally, something shifted inside, a soft clunk. The lock turned. The door groaned open with a screech that echoed through the empty cabin. Dust rolled out, stinging his nose. For a moment, all Caleb saw was blackness. Then he reached in and pulled out the first object, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked but intact. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, heavy and rectangular. He peeled it open, and his breath caught. Inside lay maps, detailed, hand-drawn maps of the Red Rock territory, creeks, mines, trails, all marked. But one map bore a symbol that stopped Caleb cold, a red X, deep in the canyon country, and alongside the maps, folded carefully, was a document stamped with the seal of the United States Army. It was a land claim, a deed, signed, sealed, and filed away but never delivered. The safe didn't hold gold. It held something more dangerous. It held the key to the richest silver strike in the territory, hidden for years by a rancher who had wanted no man, least of all outlaws like Slater, to ever find it. The sheriff's warning. When Caleb rode back into town, the safe empty but the journal and maps tucked in his saddlebag, Sheriff McGraw was waiting. Word is Slater lost 3 men in the hills last night, the sheriff said, eyes narrowing. He's coming for you. And he won't stop. Caleb handed him the army-stamped document. The sheriff read it, jaw tightening. Well, I'll be damned. This here deed, it's government sealed. Whoever holds it owns that canyon land, and I reckon Slater's been after it for years. So the rancher kept it locked away, Caleb said. The sheriff nodded grimly. Problem is, now that you've got it, you're wearing a target bigger than the church steeple. Slater won't rest till he's got that claim, and half the men in this town would sell their mothers for what's buried out there. Caleb felt the weight of the maps against his ribs. He hadn't asked for this, but the moment he'd laid eyes on that rusty safe, his trail had changed, and there was no turning back. And the high noon duel. Slater didn't wait long. 3 days later, he rode into Red Rock Gulch with 6 men at his back. Dust clouded their horses, spurs jingled like funeral bells. They tied their mounts outside the Silver Spur and walked straight down the middle of the street. Caleb was already there. He stood alone, coat open, hand loose at his side. The town shuttered its windows. Mothers pulled children indoors. Everyone knew what was coming. Cowboy, Slater called, his voice carrying in the dry air. We end this today. You give me the maps indeed, or you die with Caleb's gray eyes locked on his. You mocked me for buying that safe. Laughed at me. But you never understood. What a man holds ain't worth a damn if he ain't willin' to bleed for it. The Slater sneered, hand hovering near his gun. Then bleed. The street held its breath, hands twitched. Then the world snapped into motion. 2 revolvers roared at once. When the smoke cleared, Slater stumbled, a crimson bloom spreading on his chest. His revolver slipped from his hand, clattering into the dust. He fell to his knees, eyes burning with fury. You don't know what you're meddling in, he rasped. Then he pitched forward, dead. His gang scattered, breaking like dry brush before a storm. Caleb reholstered his Colt and tipped his hat against the sun. The legacy of the rusty safe. Days later, in the sheriff's office, Caleb spread the maps across the desk. The townsfolk gathered, whispering. The canyon marked with the red X was real, untouched, rich with silver veins that could change the fortune of the whole territory. Wes, that old rancher, wanted to keep it out of greedy hands. The sheriff muttered. Caleb nodded. He locked it away, knowing men would kill for it. Maybe hoping one day, someone would use it for more than just gold. The sheriff leaned back. And what about you, Hart? You riding out there to stake your claim? Caleb stared at the maps a long time. The laughter, The mockery, the gunfights, they all circled back to one choice: a cowboy buying a worthless safe. But he didn't answer right away. Instead, he rolled the maps tight, tucked them back into the journal, and stood. "Some things ain't meant for one man alone," he said. "This land'll feed a town, build homes, keep folks alive. That's worth more than silver in my pocket." The sheriff watched him walk out, boots echoing on the boards. And as Caleb swung into his saddle, the townfolk who had once mocked him now tipped their hats in respect. The cowboy who bought a rusty safe had unearthed a secret bigger than gold. A secret that had changed Red Rock Gulch forever. Epilogue. Months later, riders came from miles around to work the canyon. A mining town sprang up, rough but thriving. Red Rock Gulch grew, its saloon bustling, its children fed. And though folks still told the story, they told it different now. They mocked the cowboy for buying a rusty safe. They'd say over whiskey and poker. But what he found inside shocked the whole damn West. And somewhere out on the trail, Caleb Hart rode on, hat low against the sun, chasing the horizon. Just another cowboy with dust on his boots and secrets in his past.